Welcome everyone to the 7th lecture in the series, and this one is envy. Envy I described in a previous lecture as, for me, the most disgusting sin. What did I mean by that? Well, one argument about the 7 deadly sins, right, is that they all have kind of become positive attributes for some people in the contemporary world, right? Pride is all about your self-esteem. Do you have a lot of self-esteem? It's a good thing. Anger, well, you're assertive. You don't want to be weak. In the workplace, you want to be assertive. Sloth is about your relaxation. How well are you able to relax? Take some downtime. Take some sloth time. Avarice, well, this is your enterprise. Are you going to be a good business person or not? Gluttony is your appetite. I hope you have a good appetite. Otherwise, you're unhealthy, apparently. And then finally, last, well, it's your libido. You go to counselors now when you lose your libido. Not enough lust is a problem. Now, envy, for me, arguably, maybe by the end of the lecture we'll all have a different opinion, but envy for me is perhaps the one sin that has not been reconciled. Now, if you're thinking of envy as jealousy, I'm sure then we could reconcile it with ambition or something like that, or a desire to improve. I see how somebody else does something that I want to do myself, and I strive to become better. I was watching a documentary about Michael Jordan, the basketball player, and his brother was better at him at basketball, and it strove him on. He kind of had a jealousy towards his brother, and then he became the greatest basketball player that will ever live. So, all right, so maybe if we take jealousy as the sin, then I agree. It has a modern positive spin. But envy, I don't think does. So we need to understand what envy is. And to do that, let's have a joke. This is one way to understand what envy is, specifically for medieval theologians and medieval thinkers. And it's a joke. And it's not a nice joke, I'm sorry. There are bits that you won't like, but it's, you're not expected to laugh either. So there's a British man, a French man, and a Russian man. Okay. And the British man, and they're all given one wish. They've got one wish. A genie appears and grants them all one wish. And the Englishman says, well, back home, I've got this friend, and he's got this enormous cottage. It's beautiful, and it's got all of these different floors, and it's got a swimming pool. I want the same cottage, only twice as big, with 2 swimming pools and a tennis court and a lovely hedge. That's what I want. And the Frenchman says, well, back home, I've got this friend, and he's got this new lover, this woman, and she's beautiful, and she's wonderful. I want a lover just as beautiful, but I want her to be 5 years younger, blah, blah, blah. She has longer blonde hair, and to be more successful. Okay. And then the Russian man is asked, and he says, back home, I have this neighbour, and he has a cow. And it produces loads of wonderful milk. It's a beautiful cow. I want that cow dead. Okay, so this is the joke. And this, for me, is the essence of the medieval idea of envy or invidia. It is not wanting what someone else has. It is not wanting even to be what someone else is. It is wanting someone else to fail, wanting the destruction of somebody else or their property. As a way into this concept, which incidentally, this does survive. I think that we all have modern competing definitions of envy, and we will talk about them. There is contemporary psychoanalysis and psychology, which sometimes conflates envy with all sorts of other things, which accepts this destructive element. There are some forms of modern theory that don't, that just conflate it with jealousy, that it's all about wanting to be something, rather than wanting someone else not to be something, which I think is the medieval idea intact. But look, here's a modern example, I think, that captures this envy perfectly. Here's Otto Dick's painting in the 1930s, his 7 deadly sins. I wonder if you can identify all of them. Some of them are quite obvious. Here we have avarice, crawling around on the floor for money. Here we have anger, the ferocious beast with the horns. We have pride at the back there, which actually incidentally has an anus for a mouth, horribly, and a little person in it. Gluttony is this person staring out from the cavernous mouth of this enormous beast. Lust is always quite boring in its representation. There aren't many variations. Leaves only 2 candidates for envy, doesn't it? As you know, there's this enormous figure here with his scythe, and there's this small character here. This character here is missing a heart. There's no heart. The heart has been ripped out of this reaper. This, in fact, is sloth. Sloth which lacks a heart, which hasn't got the appetite for anything except destruction, perhaps, destruction of itself. Leaving this figure here for envy. This is 1933. Otto Dix is a German artist. Interestingly enough, this figure was first painted without the moustache. And then the following year, Otto Dix added in the moustache, or a little bit later, not the following year, quite a little bit later, which is interesting in itself. I want to focus on a couple of things that we learn from looking at this figure of envy. And I think it can open up what I think are three crucial nexuses of inquiry, things that are associated with envy across the history, really, of the Western ideas of the sins, but also most especially in the Middle Ages. Three associations that I'm going to explore in this lecture. We're all going to explore together. What do you notice about envy, first of all? And we have a microphone. Tell us something about the way envy is depicted here. Moustache or no moustache? I have the mic. Who would like to? Nikita, please.
Probably the first one is eyes. You're always looking around and you're always trying to find someone else who is better than you, in better conditions than you. And the left eye, in like his or her, I don't know, eyes are looking in different like sides, and he or she is in constant search of source of envy, source for envy.
Yes. Okay, so the roving eye, the eyes that move around. Absolutely. Alina, next.
I don't know. For me, it looks like this man is having a heart attack, so maybe it's a representation that envy causes a physical pain to its owner.
Pain element. There's some pain here. Generally, what's happening with both hands is very interesting, actually. We have one clutching himself, but the other clawing at something. Any other comments to make? I think, Anne, you had your hand up.
The envy here is the shortest character, the most little in height, and also it looks unsatisfactory, always unsatisfactory.
Yeah, there's a deep misery in envy here, a deep, deep misery, which even, for me, the other sins are kind of having a good time, more or less having a good time. I accept some of them aren't. Avarice looks pretty spooked down here. Anger is having, a bit of a frenzy. Lust seems to be having a good time. Sloth. Envy is in a pit of despair. So it's a good point. Okay, guys, you narrow down lots of the things that are going on here. The eyes are going to be very, very important in representations of envy. And it opens up this central mystery. What is it about the envious eye? Is it, as you say, Nikita, that the problem with the envious subject, as it's represented in art and literature, is that the eyes rove around. The eyes are never satisfied, always looking. And it's that lack of satisfaction in what one has, possibly. I also wonder, though, if there's some problem with the eye, some cloud which prevents vision. This is a bit of a paradox. But yes, let's see. So the eye will be the first section. This is, by the way, St. Lucy. She is the saint who's lost her eyes. They were gouged out, I believe. She's a martyr. And she's often depicted in medieval art holding her eyes, her heavenly eyes, the eyes that, either the eyes that were gouged out or the ones that she will get back in the afterlife. We'll talk about the eye. We'll talk about eyes. We'll talk about representations of eyes in envious art, and also theories of vision, and how envy itself leads to a certain kind of theory of how we see or do not see other people in our community. The second thing is what you mentioned, Alina, that nasty aggression that is there. I believe you mentioned it. There's a certain aggression in envy. There's a question about, and of course this cuts deeper than just that subject, and this is where the moustache is quite important. If Otto Dix is interpreting Hitler as, in some way, the envious subject par excellence, there is a sense in which envy is not satisfied in a self-contained pit of despair, that there's also this reaching out to destroy. And it can lead to not just the destruction of other people's things, but also persecution more generally. So a question I want to ask is, how does envy fit into ideas about persecution of the other in the Middle Ages and beyond? Like, when we see acts of of terrible persecution, genocide? Is envy a factor? Is that an explanatory factor? And aggression more generally. And finally, I don't think anyone mentioned this, but maybe that clawing at the self, the self-destructive nature of envy. And generally, I want to open the question about self-harm, about how really when one is envious, on the one hand, one destroys oneself through the act of envy, but also how one deliberately sabotages one's own life. And every aspect of envy that we will look at, there is this element of self-sabotage. Whether it's deliberate or a byproduct of envy is an interesting question. Okay, let's begin with the I then. And this is where we need to do some etymology. We need to look at what this word is in Latin. Let's remember, of course, that when the 7 sins were in Greek, when they were the 8 generic thoughts of Evagrius Ponticus, there was no envy. Envy was not one of the 8 generic thoughts. When Cassian first Latinized the 7 deadly sins and made them 7, envy was also not there. He had sadness, and despair, which Gregory the Great then, in the 6th century, translated this idea of despair into envy. And that word he used was invidia. Invidia. Now, there is still some debate about what this word is getting at. And in fact, all of the medieval attempts to understand this word stumble on this central problem. Is it saying not seeing or seeing against? Well, you see the root there, and you know from the word video, of course, which is from the Latin, video as I see, to see. Videre is to see in Latin, and it's this in videre. So what does that in mean? It doesn't mean in, it's not seeing in. Some argue that it means, as I say, not seeing. In videre, like an impossibility of seeing. In videre, I cannot see. If you have invidia, envy, it is not seeing. Others would explain this etymology this way. It's seeing against something. Deliberately seeing things in a way that goes against some particular thing. This distinction, I hope, as we go on, will become more important. But needless to say, and this is why I'm glad you mentioned the eyes straight away, with envy, vision is very important. What you see and what you do not see seems to be the essence of how envy operates. It's not what you dream, what you hear about. It seems to be what you specifically see. So let's go to some classical definitions. Here's Aristotle. Envy is a kind of pain at the sight of another's good fortune. So on the one hand, this shows that this idea is older than medieval. On the other hand, notice again, the sight is emphasized for Aristotle. Let's go to a piece of medieval art that hopefully should tell us something about this problem. Is it seeing against or not seeing at all in terms of envy? This is from the Scrovegni Chapel in Padua. This is by Giotto. And this is his, as you can see right at the top there, invidia, his personification of envy. Giotto, of course, is, we think, he used to be described as the first Renaissance artist, which, of course, impossible to say. But certainly we would say that he belongs to an exceptional school of artists. And his works are extremely important and so on, and they bear our analysis. They are richly detailed and dense, and they're very deliberate. What strikes you about envy here? To play the game again, what do you see and what do you not see? How is envy represented by Giotto? This is his personification of envy. There's some very interesting details here. Yeah, Marianne?
Yeah, I see the fire at the bottom, which is very connected to that self-harm concept that we talked about.
So, the question remains, is he in a fire of his own making or someone else's making? But yes, envy and yes, there's a sort of harm or self-harm element. Yes.
We can see a snake goes from her mouth, which is biting her. So she's biting herself.
This is the horrifying aspect of of this depiction. The snake coming from the mouth and biting back in the eye. Yes, Anne.
She also has giant ears, which represent the way she listens to everybody around her, and probably she wants to find out the dirty secrets of other people, gossips, stuff.
Yes, absolutely. Gossip and listening to rumors and secrets, that's absolutely, I think, what that ear means. Yes, Alina.
I think the important aspect is that she's holding something, so she's not driving by need, in some sense, because she already owns something, she just wants more. So.
Yes, so there is another element. It does hit on another sin, like the sin of avarice, possibly, wanting more of something. We'll ask what the relationship of that is, but yes.
Maybe it's about her hand. She's reaching for something, another which she's not has right now.
Yeah, it's that hand, that horrifying claw, the animalization of it. I totally agree with you. It's disturbing at the very least. Sorry, Alina, I'll just take this. There's a lot to say there. I'm intrigued by the fact that all of you gender this as female as well, but I think I agree with you. It's just about gendered female, I think. This is because the Latin word is feminine. That's at least one explanation in videos, usually seen that way. I wonder myself if there's also an anti-Semitic dimension, that there are one or two cues that are often associated with Jewish people in medieval art. The horns would be the thing there. The horn, I believe this is a horn. The elongation of the ear, possibly, also the money bag. All of these things are often seen in anti-Semitic art. But okay, but we focus in on that element, as you say, that element of the snake coming out of the mouth and back into the eye. Somehow, it's almost, I suppose, the reading that you get stitching between your different views is that whatever the poison is, and there is poison here, obviously, the snake associated with poison, and of course the poison here being associated with the words, that this character Envy is saying something against, or spitting poison at someone, or directing some hate towards someone. But that, of course, it returns. Now, it seems to be returning, but it's not returning to bite them in the chest or wherever around the body. It's specifically the eye. And, of course, how we interpret that is difficult. Do we interpret it as your poison will block you from really seeing this person? If I'm so full of poison for Professor Grishin, I'm not, obviously, I just have to use him as my example. If I really hate Yevgeny, which I don't, is it that because I've got all this poison coming out of my mouth, I can't see the beautiful figure of Yevgeny for what he is? That this is precisely what's happening. There is something in my eye. There is something in the way that stops me seeing. Rather than envy being, I see you perfectly, but my hate makes me have this extra poison, it's like my hate has stopped me from seeing you. I cannot see you because my hate is in the way. And it's this kind of obsession with vision that we can see through different works of Western art. This is a little bit later. This is Botticelli. This is from the end of the 15th century, the Calumny of Apelles. And who is Envy in this image? Which character represents envy? These are personifications of different vices and virtues. Yes, Anne? You have the microphone.
Well, probably the blind one.
This figure here?
Yeah.
Blind envy. In fact, no. This figure is the ruler, the king, who has been betrayed. So consequently, envy is.
What about that one on the bottom?
I'm not sure who this is actually. I think this is humility or someone. Envy is this figure here, reaching out to obstruct the vision, reaching out towards the eyes and wanting to block them out. This refers to a specific legend, but nevertheless, the element is there. Just to raise the point, and it opens up new questions. Envy is here represented as an obstruction of someone else's vision. Nevertheless, it's still obstructing vision, but it just opens that question. I cannot bear to see. Is he doing that, or is he just blotting out the person's face? There's also that element, I suppose, we could read into it. Let's go to a dictionary definition. This is one of the first dictionaries that we can find, which mentions envy. Giovanni Balbi's Catholicon. Envy. I envy you, that is, I do not see you because I cannot bear to see you prosper. So again, you see this dual thing. I don't see you because I don't want to see you, which means I won't see you. It's this circular thing. I can't bear to see your success, so I can't see you. I don't want to see you, so I'm going to stop seeing you. Or equally, we could have William Peraldus in his Summer on Vices. Envy cannot see good things unless it sees bad in them. So even within this simple question of what's the relationship between envy and sight, you see there are all sorts of different associations and different interpretations. Is it that my hate stops me from seeing you? Is it that I stop being able to see good things at all because like I'm wearing blinkers, I can only see the bad things? Is it that I can't bear to see you and I block you out? Or do I want to stop you from seeing me too? All of these are different slight interpretations, but within all of them there is this obsession with what you can see, what you cannot see, and what you cannot bear to see. And envy, at the very least, seems to be about not being able, for one of these reasons, to see who you are, to see who you, the other, are, to encounter other people, to encounter them in a situation and not to see them because there is something in my way, and that something is my envy, my hate, which blinds me to seeing the full. If it's Yevgeny Grishin, my good friend, I cannot see him because of this hate that has clouded my judgment, and it stops me from seeing him in his full light. To continue this exploration of vision, I think it is a good time to go to Dante, at the very least, because I think the way he deals with envy in Purgatorio is the most creative. And it blends together these problems of vision and what you can see and what you cannot see. Purgatorio, written around about 1320. As you recall, in the Purgatorio, we have a mountain where all the 7 deadly sins are purged one by one. Dante has already been, and there's a huge slope before you get to the mountain, where people have to earn their place on the mountain, so it's actually a long journey. By the time we get to envy, terrace number 2, which is the ranking order of the sins, second worst sin for Dante, by the time we get there, he's already purged himself of pride, which by holding the enormous rock, all of the souls have held the enormous rock on their backs for, hundreds, if not thousands of years. Here we are in the terrace of envy, and what Dante discovers is fairly interesting. First, he arrives and he starts to hear this singing, and they are examples of great charity, which Dante sets up, as many other thinkers did, as the opposite of envy. When I want the best for you, when I want you to succeed, that's charity, that openness, the generosity of spirit. And he hears, for example, I think it's, they do not have any wine, this passage which refers to the Feast of Cana, where Jesus turned water into wine, right? He, out of his enormous abundance of charity, he provided for all these people. And Dante then sees the souls, and he describes the enormous pity that he feels. When Dante's in the Inferno, he doesn't feel any pity for the sinners, right? He does at first, and then he learns not to trust them. If you read the Inferno, it's fascinating, because the sinners in the Inferno never repent. They always make excuses for themselves. I was born in Florence, and it's not fair, and it's unfortunate that it happened this way, but I fell in love, and blah, blah, blah. And at the start of the Inferno, Dante, his heart opens. But by the end of Inferno, he's even kicking people's hands, he knows not to trust any soul in hell. Purgatorio is different. All of these souls are in an act of penance. They're all making amends for what they did wrong in their lives. And they're all open, and they all admit that they did wrong. And the souls here are all admitting to their envy. What is happening to them? Let's go to this extraordinary manuscript. This is a manuscript from the last quarter of the 14th century from the Bodleian Library in Oxford. And it's a wonderful manuscript. You can actually look at it online. every single page has an illustration at the bottom. It's a very rare example of an illustrated text, fully illustrated. And here we have humility. What do you notice about humility? Let's go in a little deeper. This is Virgil here, and this is Dante. Let's go a little bit closer in. Anyway, we may have discussed this before, but what's happened to the envious? What is their penance? Is it clear from the illustration?
They are blind?
Yes, they are blind in the sense that they have had, and it's definitely not clear from the image, but we can see they have their eyes closed. Their eyes have been sewn up with iron wire. They have had their eyes sewn up with iron wire so they cannot see. Because they cannot see, they have to depend on each other and each other's kindness. I think we mentioned this in a previous lecture. Could you please pass the toilet paper? Yes. You can't see for yourself. Here's how Dante describes it. They appeared covered with coarse hair cloth. Each propped up another with his shoulder, were propped against the rock. So they're propping up one another, which is important. They're supporting one another. The haircloth is, of course, a penance. And as the sun is of no profit to the blind, so heaven's light denies its bounty to the shades in the place of which I speak. Okay, of course, they cannot see the sun. Haircloth, by the way, not only does it rip the skin a little bit, it also leaves it really cold. It sort of tears slightly at the skin, and it's thin, so the wind gets in. And then finally, for iron wire pierces all their eyelids, stitching them together, as is done to the untrained falcon, because it won't be calmed. So, iron wire then. Any comments about this macabre act? What comment do you think Dante is making on envy? Let me see, I have the microphone again. Does anyone want to help with the exegesis of this scene? Anyone? I feel like there might be some good ideas in this general area.
I feel like the general comment that he makes is that you should close your eyes. You should stop looking at other people. This is about the first painting we saw, also when the eyes were pointed in both directions, when the person was constantly looking and paying attention. And like it says that you should maybe focus on your inner self. I don't know, just close your eyes. Just don't feel that.
Thank you, Elijah. Any other comments?
Well, it's like you didn't want to see, you didn't want to look all your life, and now you're not actually going to be able to, so that's a punishment. To understand why you actually had to try to see other people, and now you can't, and you start realizing something maybe.
I think this is the perfect, I think between the two of you, you have it. I think that's exactly right. You didn't see all your life, now see the consequences of that. Marianne?
I also believe that there's a message that you're not able to cope with the situation on your own. That's why you have to find people who are just like you, and you feel that, and you have to rely on each other in some way.
Absolutely right. Okay, so we have, as Mariam says, on the one hand, this is a lesson that you do need other people, and you need them to be successful in their own lives and as well. You need them to do things well, to help, we all help each other, that we're all in a community where we help one another. I think that's a similar story is told through all of Dante's Commedia, actually, that things only work when we help one another. It's a basic message of community at the heart of the Commedia. But yes, in terms of vision, there is that ironic element. In envy, if to be envious is to not really see, because I'm so clouded by my own feelings and my hate and my agenda that I don't really see Professor Grisham. Having your eyelids sewn shut for 1,000 years, I think for Dante is a wonderful way of showing the consequences of that not seeing. Now that you can no longer see anyone at all in any sense, don't you long to see them? Don't you long to wonder what they really look like, what everything really looks like, to see again? In other words, to know the value of vision, of encountering a world which you don't already know about, rather than being locked in your own prison of yourself, to look outwards and to see the unexpected. I think this is Dante's sermon, and it's a typical sermon for him. Good points. So envy then remains fixedly this problem of refusing to see things and a pathology of vision. Back to this guy. Bernard of Clairvaux is a rich writer on all of the topics that we encounter and all of the sin topics, so I have to keep coming back to him. I hope he allows you to have some continuity. He also is one of my favourites. What does Bernard say about envy? It's quite interesting because he introduces another element, and this is where, remember we say the pathology relates to, we can do it all through sin and theology. There's also folklore or astrology or other things. Bernard has a rare moment where he introduces this folkloric history, which I think is quite interesting. Bernard talks about envy this way. Do you not want to know about the poison eye, the evil eye, the enchanted eye? Oh, yes, we do, Bernard. He's a very good rhetorician. I believe it is envy. For what is envy, after all, but to see with evil? To see with evil. Were it not for the basilisk, what? Were it not for the basilisk, never would death have come into the world through envy. Woe to miserable humans who did not foresee envy. There's so much going on there, not least this kind of seeing has another dimension if we think about foresight. But were it not for the basilisk, what on earth is this? Never would death have come into the world through envy. Now it might be, and of course we can talk about seeing with evil, it's another good definition, seeing against, not seeing at all, seeing with evil. It might be that Bernard's just mentioning the basilisk here for a bit of fun, but we can follow this idea of the basilisk through text. And what it tells us about envy is another dimension which is very interesting. What is a basilisk? What is a basilisk? Alina?
Maybe I'm being mistaken, but isn't basilisk is a mythological creature that blinds people when they saw them?
It is. What kind of creature? It's usually a... Yes, snakes, no, serpent. And of course, snakes are another element that I haven't mentioned and that we will come back to. Marianne? Okay, so yes, the basilisk, but it has another dimension. The basilisk is important because of what it does with its eyes as well. The basilisk doesn't just bite you, it kills you with its eyes. Here is, and it's kind of not what you expect a medieval basilisk to look like. You know, you'll always be disappointed, with the exception of, I think, the Harley manuscript dragon, which looks just like what you imagine a medieval dragon to look like. Often you'll be quite surprised by how these creatures look in medieval manuscripts. Here's a description from this manuscript, which is Bodley MS 764, of the basilisk. The basilisk's name in Greek, Regulus, means little king, because he is the king of creeping things. Those who see him flee because his scent will kill them, and he will kill a man simply by looking at him. The basilisk is 1/2 foot long with white spots. Okay, so this is the myth, guys. The myth is that the basilisk, as this creature, and why is it associated with envy? Because supposedly it can kill you just by looking at you. Like in ancient Greek myth of Perseus, right? He kills by the Medusa kills by looking. She also has snakes in the hair. The basilisk is supposed to be like this. Gives you one look and it will kill you. How does that work? Well, you can see why it's a good example of envy, I hope, this idea of your vision is corrupted. But it seems to add another element. Does something actually come out of the eye when you see with envy? Are you producing something hurtful when you look with envy? I don't want to give any of you the envy look, but I'll give my imaginary Professor Grishin an envious look. If I really look at him, see, look, it knocked. If you really look in a nasty, envious way, one theory of vision, right, is this is sending something horrifying out towards the person. So to understand this, and I know it's layers upon layers, but we need to understand two medieval theories of vision. What on earth is this image? Why is there an extra eye in the nose? Why must the tongue flicker? Is that where the eye is? Lots of questions, but let's focus in, shall we? This is a medieval map of the eye. And there are two theories of vision, right? And one of them I think science has proved to be correct, and the other one science has suggested is nonsense. And it's the nonsense one we're interested in. The first theory is intromission. And this one I think you are familiar with, which is the one that there is some stimuli out here which enters into the eye processes it, and then we get the vision. So light bounces off the walls into my eye, And I process that as the vision of room 312 in SAS. Simple. The other theory, though, extramission, operates like this. It's the idea that, in fact, vision is our own eyes sending out light into the world, and which then maybe bounces back. Like sonar for whales or whatever, or bats. You know, they send out an echo and it comes back. This is extramission. And it has more traction than you would think. And it has traction in, Aristotle mentions it, and it's cited frequently throughout medieval texts. Eventually, someone like Albertus Magnus in the 13th century writes a long tract about why it's wrong. But when Bernard is writing, this is still, I think, the dominant theory of vision. So here's an example. This is not a nice example. This is from Aristotle. You thought you liked Aristotle. When menstruating women look into very clean mirrors, the surface of the mirror becomes as a blood-red cloud. And when the mirror is new, it is not easy to remove this dirt, but when it is old, it is easier. Sorry, I realize that there are certain rules about representation, so I had to. So this is a really horrifying theory, really horrifying. But you see that it relies on this extramission element, that something is emitted from the eyes which has an effect, an impact on the world. In this case, menstruation and mirrors. But you see how it's not far to say the envious eye sends something out. By the way, guys, extramission theory, this is one theory as to why people salute like this, like when you see someone powerful. Supposedly, the rays, the rays from their eyes, you're blocking, the powerful person walks past, their gaze is powerful, a sign of respect. You respect how powerful the gaze is. Now, I don't know if that might be someone's imaginative interpretation, but that is certainly an interpretation which I have read. Okay, we should move on. We should move on to aggression. So when you think about the eye, I think we asked more questions than we answered there. There are some curious relationships between what you see, what you don't see, and the power of vision. But be aware, any medieval thinkers that you encounter talking about envy might operate with any one of these theories. They might operate with the theory that the envious glance can be destructive as a powerful physical thing in the world. They might operate with the theory that to see with envy is to be clouded with hate, or they might operate with another theory, but bear it in mind. Okay, envious aggression. And for this one, I want to go to one of the Western classics of envy, maybe the great stage performance of envy, which is Othello, Shakespeare. I don't know if you're familiar with Othello. There are various films. This one is my favorite. This is the Kenneth Branagh one from the 1990s. There's also one called O, which is a modern rendition. Maybe there are other excellent versions. The premise of the play centers around a mystery of hate. I'm sure you're aware of it, but if you're not, we have this figure here, Othello, who is extremely successful, a general, all right? He is newly successful. At the start of the play, there's a scandal because he has married in secret a woman named Desdemona. And Desdemona's father is a little bit unhappy about this, but everyone says, well, Othello is a great character. Othello is a great character. He's extremely successful, he's noble, he's honest. And the Duke of Venice, the Doge, says, listen to you. And of course, the problem for people, and this is 1603, we're in a society which we could label as deeply racist, although there are problems in using this term. Othello is a Moor, is how he's described. He is North African. He's described as having dark or black skin. And this is a problem for people in that setting. Like, how could this man... And Iago, this character on the right, exploits this hatred early on by screaming at Desdemona's father, I think it's this black ram is tupping your white ewe. It's a disgusting phrase. This is also, Iago says, they are making the beast, what is it, the beast with two backs? I don't know. Anyway, all of these terrible things that Iago says, but he exploits this hatred. But then the Duke of Venice says, listen, if you think about Othello's nobility and his goodness of character, then he's more fair than black. Problematic, deeply racist way of phrasing it. It is 1603, but still, it doesn't excuse it. Anyway, that's the general setup. Now, here's the enigma in the play. The enigma in the play is that this man on the right, Iago, from then on, does everything he can to destroy Othello's life. He does everything he can to destroy it. And how does he go about this? I'm sure those of you know the play remember very well. And you can see it here in this scene. He begins to spread this rumor to Othello that Desdemona has been sleeping with Cassio, who is this other man, and he's actually Iago's rival. Why does Iago do this? What does he want? And what he wants eventually is for Othello to kill Desdemona and to be killed himself. He wants nothing less than Othello's total annihilation as a character. It's not that he wants Desdemona. He doesn't want Desdemona. That's what makes it so mysterious. He just wants Othello to be destroyed. And he explains it this way. That's his face. I wanted to show the clip, but I couldn't. He just says, "But for sport and profit, I hate the more. And it is thought abroad that twixt my sheets she has done my office. I know not if it be true, but I, for mere suspicion in that kind, will do as if for surety." Different interpretations. He's saying, some people say, that she's sleeping with my wife, but I don't know if that's true. The reality in the play is he does not care. He's not interested. Iago himself does not feel jealousy of Othello in the sense that he wants something Othello has for himself. As I say, he feels invidia, envy. He cannot bear to see Othello succeed. He wants Othello to fail. He's not interested in gaining anything out of it for himself. And this is what is so frightening about the play, I think. And it's that phrase, "but for sport and profit," the gratuitousness of what he wants. Now, how he does this in the play is he stimulates the hatred. He stimulates Othello's own envy, or his own jealousy, right? So Iago says, "Look, I didn't want to have to tell you this. I'm so sorry, but I know she's been sleeping with Cassio. Your wife Desdemona has been sleeping with Cassio." And he gives all of this circumstantial proof. But in the end, Othello starts to get jealous. All he can see in his mind's eye is Desdemona sleeping with Cassio. He feels deep insecurities about himself. He says, it's because I'm black, isn't it? This is why of course, I understand. She's been loosened. So it's this it's really sad. It's deeply sad to think about this, that his insecurities in an unstable racial political climate are exploited by Iago. And then Othello, almost going wild, steels himself and gets angry with Iago. And he says, "Well, give me the ocular proof. I want the ocular proof. Give me some reason. I think you're lying. You're making it all up. Desdemona is not sleeping with Cassio. I want the ocular proof." The interesting thing to me in that scene is that Iago has got him so worked up with his own jealousy that it's almost as if Othello would prefer to have the proof that his wife is definitely sleeping with Cassio than to have the opposite proved. It's almost like he would prefer to see that she's been cheating him than to see the opposite. And this is the frightening aspect, and this is, I think, an important aspect of envy. You almost want the bad thing. You want rather than the good thing. And then finally, look, this is it's a bit too dark for you to see very well. But of course, like all Shakespearean tragedies, it ends terribly badly. It ends that Othello does strangle Desdemona in the bed. The ocular proof was a handkerchief which Iago managed to steal and say, "Look, how on earth would Cassio have Desdemona's handkerchief that you gave her if they weren't sleeping together?" And then I think he uses that handkerchief, I'm not sure, but he strangles Desdemona, right? And then eventually all is revealed, and Iago does get his comeuppance, but he just chooses to stop speaking by the end. When they all start calling him a dog, "You're a devil, you're a low-down dog," and Iago says, "You know my situation, I will speak no more," and says nothing more. And of course they all end up dead and gutted on this bed. Why spend so much time with this? Well, two things. First of all, I think it really dramatizes this problem of envy as something that you want. It's some temptation of its own. You're almost drawn to discover something terrible about someone else so that you can punish them for it. But look, I think at the center of this, there are issues of persecution and hatred and racial violence as well. which all will have resonances as we explore how envy worked in the Middle Ages, but also how envy works today. This not wanting to see the other enjoy something of their own often is played out in the space of racial antagonism. As we'll see, in medieval Christianity, this perception that Jews are enjoying something that Christians are not becomes the motive for great persecution and rage and violence. And I think we can call that motive envy. This is where we go modern, because I think Jacques Lacan's theory of jealousy and envy might be useful here. It's, of course, the French psychoanalyst smoking his cigar. Lacan has this absurd theory of jealousy in terms of sexual relations, which I think deserves spelling out. On the one hand, he says, true envy is the envy that makes the subject pale before the image of a completeness closed upon itself. What does that mean? Well, as a theory of envy, this is a bit like Iago in Othello. He sees Othello at the start, and the problem for Iago is, arguably, Othello is complete. He is a complete person. He is the complete character. He is a perfect soldier, a perfect general, and a perfect lover, and a perfect human. And for Iago, possibly, it's just too much for him to bear. He cannot bear to see someone perfect in the world. And it's that, so for Lacan, you witness in the other person a completeness that you can never have, or at least it's an illusion of completeness, and it makes you deeply upset. It makes you hate. This is, I think, fairly simple. But when he applies it to sexual relations, this is where it becomes quite interesting, because this is where the perverse element comes in. And he's talking about here about Lebensneid, which is this German idea of the envy for living in a certain way or being something that someone has, is the jealousy born in a subject in its relation to another, insofar as this other is held to enjoy a certain form of jouissance or superabundant vitality the subject perceives as something that it cannot apprehend. The person then becomes jealous to the point of hatred and the need to destroy. So you see again, it's about that completeness of the other. But notice that word there, jouissance. It's not so much when someone has something or is something, it's when they're enjoying that something that for Lacan, the thing comes problematic. Iago starts his journey of destruction at the moment that Othello is laughing and smiling and having a wonderful time at his own wedding. And this precipitates the worst kind of envy, of jealousy, of destructive violence. We could think about this again in relation to this artwork of envy here, and it's that movement from, contemplating someone in their completeness to wanting to destroy it, and you can sort of put it in these terms, like, I hate him, he's able to have all the fun that I can never have. This might be the subtitle here. Like, this king in his completeness, obviously not before the scene in the painting. A king, he's envious of him in this scene because he's complete. This person has all the things that you want that you cannot have. But again, to re-emphasize, it's not that you want something and you want that thing, and that's where the envy resides. The envy resides in wanting to destroy that thing in the other, to make sure that they do not have it. Just a couple of things here. This is Cain killing Abel. This is actually, I wonder with Lacan, I think I might have missed out a possible point, so I might just go back just a little bit there. If you think about sexual relations, Lacan has this other provocative point, which he says, in a couple, if there's a partnership, man and a woman or a man and a man, and you suspect the other person of having sex with someone else, for Lacan, he says, that jealousy, it's pathological. Even if your partner is really sleeping with someone else, it's still pathological. And it's a fascinating idea. Why? Because the point is that your fixation is so extreme. Like when you become jealous and you start to hate and you become obsessed, The fixation is the pathological thing. And it doesn't matter whether there's any truth in it or not. Why is it you need for there to be a truth? And in Othello, this is what happens. Othello needs for there to be a truth. He needs it. By the end of that play, he wants it to be true that Desdemona is sleeping with Cassio, because for some reason, because the jealous rage has got to him, because he almost can't contemplate that Cassio can enjoy something so completely. Okay. A fairly complex idea. We can talk about that in seminars, perhaps. I just thought at this stage that we would mention Cain and Abel, because this is the very first act of envy in the Bible, if you like. Cain killing his brother. Notice in this particular image that he can't bear to look at him as he does it. Maybe a commentary on it. But for a modern example, I thought I'd turn to ice skating, just for the end here. Is anyone familiar with this scandal? Yeah. Great. I'm going to ask, because you haven't spoken, Daria, could you explain it to us? Sorry.
Unfortunately, I do not much about this story. Both of them are ice skater,
yes.
Tonya Harding and Nancy Kerrigan.
Yeah.
Both of them had a competition.
Yes.
And both of them were stronger competitor. But just it was the story that Nancy had better program and she demonstrated better her skill, and Tonya just feel envy and just guys, do you remember what happened next?
Can someone complete the story?
Well, it's actually complicated.
There's one crucial act that happens, yeah.
Well, I saw the movie, I, Tonya.
Oh, yeah.
And, well, the basic result is that the knee of Nancy Kerrigan got broken by men who were, well, basically working for Tonya, something like that. And she wasn't able to compete, if I remember it correctly.
You're absolutely right. So 2 ice skaters, both of them extremely successful, in competition with one another in the run-up to the 1994 Winter Olympics. And the basic envy story is that it all results in violence. And I'm not sure whether the facts were ever established properly, but basically it's assumed that Tonya Harding's boyfriend and his friend, basically they attacked Nancy Kerrigan and tried to break her leg. So this is like the supreme act of envy, right, in one sense, right? It's not... Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of questions. Do you want to be her or whatever? But it's obviously an act of wanting to destroy your rival. Now, I think it was interesting at the time because it was perceived, and there were a lot of like American class politics in there, but it was perceived that Nancy Kerrigan was everything that Tonya Harding could never be. Naturally graceful, where Tonya Harding had to work at it. More... I don't know, like traditional male fantasy of feminine, where Tonya Harding was muscular. More perfect seeming in every way, hair and everything. You know, in other words, the theory of envy that would go there would be that Nancy Kerrigan was an image of the completeness that Tonya Harding could never, or she felt she could never have. This illusion of completeness, which, guys, of course, is an illusion. Completeness is impossible, and you know the pathological thing is imagining that this person has something I could never have. Already, this is a problem because it's just a distortion of reality. But the point to make there again is look at the end result, resulting in aggression, destruction, attack. This is an important element with all envy that we need to consider. So, rounding off this section, how and when does envy become a trigger for harm? It's something for us to think about. But when does it go beyond just wanting individual's harm? When does it become something like persecution? When does it become a fixation on an illusion of what someone else has, which is then extrapolated towards a race of people, for example? This race of people enjoys this advantage that we don't. This is when envy can be extrapolated in the most horrifying way, and we'll talk about that in the second lecture today. Final point, and this will be the quick section, the brief section that we just skip through breezily, which is self-harm. I think a lot of this has been implicit already, that we see this envy has this self-destructive element. I mean, for Tonya Harding, I mean, did she think she would get away with it? You know, was there also an element of, I know I'm going to bring down my own career through doing this? With Iago, did he really think that he'd get away with it? He's obviously destroying his own social community, his own life. It's no surprise that he ends up dead. There is a self-destructive element. But here we explore the more explicit self-destructive elements. And the key question here is, again, is self-destruction a byproduct of your envy? I envy someone, I envy Professor Grishin so much that as a byproduct, I'm going to start hurting myself. Or is it a deliberate factor? When I hate someone, I'm really hating myself at the same time. And how is this framed in the literature? We could go to Ovid, Metamorphoses. We'll be reading this section. This is a different scene in Ovid, by the way. This is Circe pouring poison in a pool. I just thought it was such a great painting of envy that we just had to have it there. For Ovid, she gnaws and is gnawed, herself her own punishment. So the one view of self-harm is like this is a byproduct. You're going to hate so much, you're going to hurt yourself in the process. And that the punishment of envy is that you end up corroding yourself. So if you think of Giotto, again, all these snakes coming out of your mouth, they're going to come back to bite you. The envious man is consumed by envy inside and out. This is Giovanni of Viterbo in his Liber de Regimine Civitatem from the 13th century. The envious man is consumed by envy inside and out. Notice the flames there, this idea of being consumed by it, like being eaten up, swallowed by it. We could go a little bit later. Andrea Alciato's Emblemata. This is the early 16th century, around about the same time as Hieronymus Bosch's painting of the Seven Deadly Sins that we began with in the very first lecture. You see here another vision of Invidia with snakes, again, coming out of the mouth. Invidia is described as a filthy woman chewing the flesh of vipers, whose eyes give her pain, who gnaws her own heart in the grip of emaciation and pallor, carrying prickly sticks in her hand. Thus is envy depicted. Gnaws her own heart. I'm just curious about this. I don't have a definitive answer, but I'm interested in exploring further this element of self-harm. Like, I eat away at myself through my hate. You know, is it just a byproduct, or am I deliberately doing it? But there we are, again. And I think, you know, another question here, of course, is envy a beautiful character? As you saw in that first image, envy is beautiful. And this is a seductive element of envy, that there's this kind of grace, but envy also as someone who becomes deformed. And why and how the artist does that is interesting. Let's go to Slavoj Žižek just for a second, because I think this self-harm is kind of played out well in one of his jokes. And it's a classic kind of joke. Obviously, he's a psychoanalyst. A witch appears to a peasant and makes him an offer. I will do to you whatever you wish, but I warn you, I'm going to do the same thing for your neighbour twice. And the peasant, with a cunning smile, tells her, okay, take out one of my eyes. Oh, it's horrible. But it's a classic moment. Again, it summarizes envy quite well. I'm happy to hurt myself if it means hurting my neighbour doubly. So this opens the question for me. Is self-harm, as it's presented through envy, is self-harm, as I say, a byproduct, something you didn't want, but it just happens? Or is it like something like collateral damage? I'm willing to absorb some hate if it means getting something done. You might ask yourself, and I keep asking about this question, where is envy in the modern world, and how do we sometimes make envy a positive thing? One answer might be, well, when is hate ever rendered positive? When is the hope for someone else's destruction ever rendered positive? I think in certain judicial circles it is, right? Like in certain legal battles, I want to sue someone for what they did to me, and I want them to have damage done to I want them to be bankrupted. I think there are certain people in American politics right now who would like to see some other American politicians bankrupted and destroyed. Maybe not killed, but destroyed. And I think that's one rhetoric of when envy and the destruction involved in it is rendered as positive. Like, it's justice, it's retribution. Like, this person should suffer because they made my family suffer. This person should suffer because they made the American people suffer. The question with that is, how much hate are you willing to take on in the process of bringing about that supposed justice? For the medieval writers, like St. Bernard of Clairvaux, it's never acceptable. You should forgive your enemies. You know, if someone, even a politician who screwed over the entirety of a country, as some Americans believe one or more politicians have done, should be forgiven. According to Bernard of Clairvaux, if he was conjured up in a puff of smoke, he'd say, let bygones be bygones, no more impeachment, no more whatever. But for some, if we take the American example, that would be awful. That would be immoral. You think of Thomas Aquinas saying it's weak to step back and do nothing. It's weakness. For some, there should be some kind of righteous retribution. So envy, I imagine, could have an equilibrium to it, just like anger and pride. Some amount of wanting the destruction of your enemies would be a good thing. It's difficult to know, but this is why I bring in the question of self-harm, because if we accept that there's collateral damage in this hate, which we might not accept, but if we do accept, then is it a price that is waged up? And how is that price imagined? Or is it more total? Like, you know, you start hating and you're basically lost in self-harm. Like the way Augustine said that to begin getting angry is to become given over to hate. Now, one figure, and it's interesting to think about redemption in this context, is this figure in medieval thought. Who is this figure? It's a 5-letter name. Who is this supposedly envious figure in the center? Any thoughts? Okay, and the time is up. Any answers, Tersen? Who could it be?
I don't know, maybe Judas?
Judas, yes. Perfect, yes. Judas. This is Judas. And this is how we're going to finish this particular lecture, with the enigma of Judas. Okay, so Judas. What do we know about Judas Iscariot? Judas Iscariot is supposed to be the disciple of Jesus who betrayed Jesus. Now, why did he do it? The Gospels do not explain. Other lives of Judas and apocryphal materials try to explain it. You know that he took money to do this, 30 pieces of silver. So we could also explore Judas in terms of avarice, but that doesn't seem to explain the Judas problem, because Judas was willing to let his leader be destroyed, right? He was willing to let his leader be crucified. He contemplated all that Jesus was and was willing still to let him be betrayed. Yes, the money is important, but Judas throws away the money at the end. And also, it's important to note that there are also stories in the Bible about, or in the Apocrypha, about how Judas wanted the money to give to charity anyway, which is interesting. I think it's not necessarily interesting like, oh, Judas, much more conflicted character, but maybe interesting in showing that someone's trying to de-emphasize the money as the motive. And I think that envy should be appreciated as one of these motives. The willing wanting of the destruction of Jesus. Maybe contemplating the perfection of Jesus and being envious, wanting him to be destroyed. Of course, for Judas, it all goes wrong. Judas repents and he weeps and he weeps and he ends up killing himself. And this is what this image is, hanging himself from a tree. In medieval art, often there are other interesting elements which bear our reflection. One is this gratuitous self-harm that Judas levels on himself, also cutting open his entrails. What is the purpose or benefit or need for such excessive self-harm in this case? Well, he is the betrayer of the Messiah, so obviously there's an idea that it has to be absolute, total self-punishment. Okay, understandably. What is this redemptive aspect here? Why is there demon coming to take... Is this Judas's soul, which is being taken through the central aperture in his body? It is a demon taking it. I'm not sure. I actually can't find out what this homunculus is in the middle of Judas's body. I would be delighted if any of you can tell me what part of the myth this is. Maybe when we discuss the readings, we'll get a greater idea. Yeah.
What if the black figure is a devil and the homunculus is the soul, and after the death of Judas, the devil takes the soul of Judas?
Yes, I think this is a good explanation. So it's to remind us that Judas is in hell and not in heaven. After all, this is a problem in Christian theology because Jesus says, you 12 disciples will all reign in heaven, okay, over the different tribes of Israel. And this is a problem. So are we to imagine that Judas is reigning in heaven? But how? He betrayed Christ. Is it because of his penance? So maybe images like this are reassuring us, don't worry, Judas is definitely going to hell. I raised the Judas problem because we're obviously going to focus on it. There are two reasons I raise it. Number one, it's an enigma. Is it Judas's envy that leads to his action, his betrayal? Is it the envy of Christ? And I think some writings do emphasize that. The reason that's important for the second reason, and of course we can look at self-harm as well there. The second reason is that Judas is often associated with the Jews. And in fact, medieval anti-Semitism, persecution and violence towards Jewish people, is often predicated on Judas's act of betrayal. I don't know how this comes about. Is it that the word Judas looks like the word Judei? I don't know whether there's an etymological confusion. After all, they were all Jewish, as I recall, the apostles, so I don't know. But anyway, Judas is often depicted as having stereotypically Jewish features in medieval art. Often the Phrygian cap will be on Judas. Often the same kinds of nose that you see Jewish people stereotype with, Judas is also stereotyped with that. We're going to look at all that in our second lecture today, okay? Jewish stereotypes and so on. But it's just something to bear in mind that this hot sort of trio of envy, Judas, and Judaism is going to recur. And that envy is the problem, and of course not to forget something that leads to one's own self-destruction, to be consumed by the very hate that precipitated your envy in the first place. Just a quick thing to say, you'll notice by now if you've done the reading for Thursday that for some bizarre reason the story of Oedipus Rex is plastered onto the story of the life of Judas. Did you see this perhaps? That there's a myth in the Golden Legend at least circulated that Judas was abandoned as a baby and was then raised and then killed his own father and then married his own mother. So this idea is then transplanted from the myth of Oedipus Rex onto the life of Judas. Interesting in itself. Is the story of Oedipus Rex a story of envy insofar as, well, he wants what his father has, he wants to obtain his mother. Of course, this is the Freudian thesis. Well, look, this is the Freudian thesis, isn't it? The Oedipal complex, the envy of wanting your mother and destroying your father to get it and destroying yourself in the process. Notice that Oedipus, of course, gouges out his own eyes at the end of Oedipus Rex. And whether or not that's a comment on vision, I don't know. But it's definitely a cue to talk about Freud for the last point of the lecture. Why? Because if we're starting to reflect about what is the status of envy, how do we consider this thing? Like, I, at some point in my life, apparently want the destruction of others. Now, I hope none of you have this thing. I do think that we should accept that some germ of envy exists in human thought, at some level, perhaps. Like, sometimes a flicker of, why did that person have to, Yevgeny, he bought those shoes before I had a chance. I'm kind of happy when I see that he's got rain splashed all over them, he's destroyed those shoes. Just a tiny flicker of like, am I a little bit happy that he destroyed his shoes that I wanted for myself? No, because I made it up. But the point is that we accept that there's some element of this possibly in our own thought. But how far do we see it as wrong, right? Where do we moralize it? Where is it pathological? And that's why I mentioned Freud. Because for Freud's theory of human consciousness, and particularly in the development of sexuality, he essentially makes envy the center of our sexual development. He's not the only one. Melanie Klein argues that envy begins with the breast, that the child is envious, has this envious relationship or jealous relationship with the breast. But for Freud, right, remember the Oedipal complex, the sexual wishes in regard to the mother become more intense and the father is perceived as an obstacle to the mother. This gives rise to the Oedipal complex. So supposedly in men, the envy is that you want your father's destruction, right, to obtain the unobtainable object of the mother. You see the problem with it. And of course, then the other problem, the even more controversial and terrible theory of penis envy, which you can Google if you like. Did I tell you to? I didn't tell you to Google that. No, don't put in anything into Google. Not now. But both of these things, right, they make out that envy is a natural part of your consciousness. The desire for this destruction of the other, the desire to, whatever it is, destroy the phallus, I can't remember how penis envy works, is natural to you. This is part of your consciousness, to want the destruction. And I think that it's worth saying that there's a current of thought before Freud that would not naturalize envy. Evagrius Ponticus did not say it was one of the generic tempting thoughts. It is a sin. It is beyond just a tempting thought. For the medieval thought on envy, it is something corrosive, something quite extreme, wanting the destruction of the other, the basilisk's stare. And I thought we could at least question how it's become naturalized and just take a step back and think about the conditions in which wanting other people's destruction is seen as okay. And I think the judicial encounter is quite interesting there too. I won't talk about this image. I will save that for when we talk about anti-Jewish persecution. You can have a guess about what that's about. But I'm going to end with some questions, as usual. Questions for us to think about. Is envy better understood as a corruption of the I or something corrupt that comes from the I? Which of these, and of course, in which context do different authors use these ways of thinking or definitions? Under which conditions do writers imagine envy precipitating violence, anger, or persecution? Under what specific conditions? For Freud, it's just everyday sexuality. For someone like Bernard of Clairvaux, it's because the basilisk is in our heart, in some sense. And of course, in Othello, sexual jealousy is a condition in which extreme violence can follow envy. The sexual element seems to be important in Othello. Is this a vice without a positive spin? Have any modern writers redeemed invidia? Do you think envy and invidia is a useful category for thinking about contemporary calls for justice? I don't know, or maybe other examples that you encounter. Okay, guys, I think that is our lot. So I will see you all at a little bit later. I think it's 5:40. See you all at 5:40.